Hey everyone, Aaron here from A2Z Strength. Hope all is well wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the A2Z Strength Show. This is episode 6 with Dr. Roy Sugarman. Roy is a fellow of the Australian Psychological Society's College of Clinical Neuropsychology and Clinical Psychology. He is a member of the Royal Charter of Psychologists in the UK. He's an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. He's a member of the British Psychological Society Division of Neuropsychology and Faculty of Paediatric Neuropsychology, and he's a member of the American Psychological Association. In the US, he's actually on the advisory boards of several USA-based entities as a neuroscience lead with Social Health Innovations and Transhuman Incorporated. Mind Experts International, as well as directing applied neuroscience in the performance innovation team of Exos, formerly known as Athletes Performance. In his last capacity at Exos, he served as a mindset coach with the US national men's soccer team, as well as providing support for various Olympic and club level athletes in multiple sporting settings, including University of San Francisco athletes and US military special forces personnel. He is a foundation member and head neuroscientist for education technology company Box Media in the UK and the USA. In his role with Social Health Innovations, he is the co-creator of Be a Looper and Looper Enterprise, two award-winning apps addressing the issues of suicide and mental health settings. With Mobicon, he developed the neuroscience model behind Life IQ, 1700, Centre for Diabetes and Endocrinology Club, LTS Life, Fit.me, and other related health apps. He is an author of 2 critically acclaimed books, Saving Your Life One Day at a Time and Client-Centered Coaching, a trainer and coach's guide to motivating clients. His clinical work continues in traumatic brain injury, trauma, mood and anxiety, and autism spectrum disorders in children and adults. And he serves as an Adjunct Clinical Lecturer in Psychiatry at the University of New South Wales, assisting with the assessment of candidates for medicine and research into best practice in medical education. With numerous publications, Dr. Sugarman has developed an integrated approach to achieving peak performance in both body and brain, contributing to the current state of the art in both rehabilitation and peak performance circles. His online program, The Neuroscience of Peak Performance, produced by Exos, presented in the USA, has received critical acclaim. He has contributed to other Exos works promoting best self practice in professional coaching circles, and is currently developing a novel approach to using value-based methodology and coaching in both deprived and professional communities in the US with his colleagues at Exos. Now, I was put on to Dr. Sugarman from a friend of mine who saw him talk in Sydney, Australia, and he said, I've got to get him on, he is amazing. And he did not deliver here. And he did deliver here, sorry. He is unbelievable. This is one of the best talks I've actually had throughout all of my coaching life and through this podcast. It was pretty much, it's really opened my eyes in terms of the way I coach, the way I look at things, the way I look at athletes, and obviously the way I deliver certain things. And the topics we touched on was amazing. We talked on biology versus psychology. We talked on how we're inherently irrational humans trying to make rational decisions based off a rational thought process. We talked about things that drive motivation, goal setting, traumatic brain injuries, the conscious versus subconscious, working with or against our narratives that when it comes to trying to create motivation in us, serotonin, dopamine, neuroepinephrine, so many things that come and impact us when it comes to motivation. We touched on ADHD, we touched on the education system, how that may be failing. The topics were unbelievable, and it's definitely changed my life in many ways, and you're going to have a ton of gold nuggets to take away from this. This was unreal, and I can't wait for you to hear for it. So without further ado, this is Dr. Roy Sugarman. Thank you. Perfect. So Dr. Roy Sugarman, thank you very much for coming on the show.
You're welcome. It's great. Very exciting early in the morning.
Yes, nice 9:30 in the morning for us, which is quite good just to start the week off.
Yep. Nothing like jumping into the intellectual stuff early.
Awesome. So first off, I wanted to ask you, how did you come into psychology and neuroscience?
That's kind of a two-step process. I was in the South African Air Force, and was getting a bit sort of sticky, and I wasn't mad about it. So what I did was I took myself off to the medical corps, and because I had qualifications in orthotics and prosthetics, I started doing artificial limbs and helping people out who'd obviously stepped on landmines or been hit by nasty flying metal bits. And I noticed it was really a mind game for them, depending on how well they did, depending on the morning after the operation, getting straight up and walking on peg legs and all the rehab. And there was one person who was really good at it, and she was the ward psychologist. And she would get them up and motivated and doing all kinds of stuff. And, there were obviously a lot of post-traumatic stress and grief and brain injury. So I decided immediately to go and work in hospitality for 10 years and make some money so I could study. And that's what I did for the next 10 years. And while I was doing that, I came across Mike Saling and Victor Nell and a whole bunch of people in the universities who later on went to become quite famous and notorious in parts. And they introduced me to a bigger depth than I had thought of in psychology, which was brain-based behavior. And that took me into neuropsychology. So the two different paradigms at that stage, you were kind of seeing a ghost in the machine being some kind of spiritual thing that psychologists are working with. And then neuropsychology said, no, the basis of behavior is really 100% down the line going to be brain. And that was it. That started love affair with brain in the early 80s.
What do you think, that lady that you worked with the amputees, what do you think her approach was so unique, or what made her so good at what she was doing?
Mostly because her understanding of human motivation. She knew that soldiers do not like to be told. They like to be asked. Good coaches, it seems, don't tell.
Similar
they
to athletes.
Ask.
Similar to athletes.
Exactly, yeah. So the same, well, any human. So we don't mind change. We just really hate being told to change. And this makes a big difference when you are asked, when behavior is evoked by someone being warm and empathic and understanding. And she was really tough, but in such a nice way. And it looked like they were given choices about how they were going to walk. They weren't given choices of to walk or not. The doctors would say to him, look, you can walk or not, it's up to you. She would say, how are you going to walk? There was just so many subtle differences. I was taking notes the whole day, sort of shadowing her. But she understood brain. She understood that these guys couldn't do three things that every elite person needs to do. That is doing the difficult thing, which is the right thing to do when you have a choice. And she would make sure they had a choice. She would point out what was the most difficult thing to do. And then she would point out what was the most difficult right thing to do. And she was talking to the frontal lobes of the brain, to the executive functions and the prefrontal cortex. And I didn't understand all of that, but nevertheless, I was intrigued. And she was really nice. In the military, people often aren't nice to you. She was quite a high-ranking officer, and she was also extremely nice to me. And she would take me out for, chips, have a chip and tomato sauce dinner. And we'd talk for hours about how she approached human motivation and self-determination and reactance. So it was like going to the circus and watching all the performing animals in her head jumping around. And then there was an orchestra, and there was so much depth to her. And when I left the military, I never saw her again, but I always remembered her.
So does that, am I reading into things that if we have some sense of control, we are more motivated to do something?
Well, it's self-efficacy. It's the idea that what we do makes a difference, that we have a solution inside of ourselves that should be coached out, that should be advocated for. We should have the illusion of choice, because we don't really have free choice. But nevertheless, it was the idea that nothing a doctor or anybody else was going to do was going to make a difference. It's what the patient does, what the client does, what the athlete does. And this is athlete-centered coaching, that you look at their values and you look at the sense of agency, of efficacy. And when they have a sense of effectiveness, that what they will now do, and they trust that what they will now do will make a big difference, they will do it. Now, that's a tricky thing you have to coach. So I made a statement to her, which I stuck to for the next 40 years. You cannot not coach emotion. You're going to coach everything you want, but it's not outside of your scope, no matter what you do. When you work with people, you cannot not coach emotion. So you have to learn to do that. It must be part of coaching science. How do we coach emotion? Emotion is the driver of motivation. Same word, motivere, meaning motive, meaning movement, meaning emotion, meaning the reason for doing it. It's all part of the same thing. So yeah, self-efficacy becomes one of the keys. And when we're talking about the flexibility to be a good athlete or to be a good performer, you need psychological flexibility. And if you don't have a sense of that efficacy of agency, you go into experiential avoidance. You try to avoid doing the thing which is too big for you. You avoid doing the right thing, which is the correct thing to do when you have a choice. Good.
Can you expand, please, on the illusion of choice?
Yeah. So the thing we live in, obviously, is our thoughts, right? We are fused to our thoughts. We believe our thoughts are reality. But what we don't understand is that there are two competing systems in the brain. That the brain is an ecosystem made up of two major systems. The first one is fast, 300 million years old. It absolutely processes every pain signal, every single thing that goes in the world gets processed here first. It's amazingly quick, amazingly powerful, and unfortunately, it's inaccurate. It then sends the signals on to this part of our brain that develops in the first 25 years that is not genetic, which we have to build in our culture. And that is equally well connected, but not strong enough. It is brilliantly accurate, but it is too slow. Now, both of these try for control of the body all the time, and they're in competition. And if you're traumatized, the 300 million-year-old one is going to be a lot stronger. And it's going to send you information that you act on, which is not accurate. So doing the difficult thing, that's the right thing to do. When you have a choice, is not free will. You've got to fight with all of this gut feel, all of the stuff that's telling you what to do, and it's not accurate. So the idea that we are wonderful, salient human beings who absolutely are in charge of our decisions and build these beautiful features and can simulate an amazing world ahead and do the right thing, absolutely wrong. So free will is very limited. And some experts would say we have no free will at all, because every bit of information is tainted by this old, incredibly reptilian system. And the trouble is pain comes through that system before we even know we've felt anything. And since pain is not, is as somatic as emotions, now we have emotions and pain and fear and anger all being added to our decisions, and we don't even know it. So yeah, very limited free will, very poor illusion of choice. We often are behaving on the wrong information.
How does biology and psychology influence our human behavior?
Well, that depends on your philosophy. So I'm a neuroscientist. So for me, all behavior emerges from a brain process. Otherwise, I'd be a proctologist if the glutes were that important, So everything comes from the brain. And obviously, where psychology is important is, let's take depression, for example. In depression, you have anhedonia, which is your dopamine isn't able to get you enjoying things the way you used to. So that's pretty physical. You have sadness and melancholy and guilt, which is serotonin not doing its job. And so that's pretty neurochemical. Then you have exhaustion and fatigue, psychomotor retardation, which is norepinephrine, noradrenaline not doing its job. And then you have sleep-inducing peptides that are not switching your anxiety. So where's the psychology? The learned helplessness, the idea that what you are going to do is not going to make a difference, that you have no control, no agency, and that your negativity bias, the way you see things, which is, by the way, more neurological, screens out all the positive opportunities that might work, and we develop ambivalence. So where psychology and biology mix is increasingly, you need to understand what happened in the seconds before a decision, microseconds, in the seconds before a decision, in the minutes before a decision, the hours before a decision, the days, the months, the years, and in fact, the thousands of years. So let me give you an example. If you take people who eat some bad food, as you taste the very off food, what happens is the insula in your brain goes, oh, this is disgusting, and you retch it out. But nature then says, well, I've got another use for that system. What about moral disgust? Not gustatory, but moral. I don't like that guy. There's something about him makes me sick to my stomach. Whatever he says, this coach, leads to a bad taste in my mouth. That's a very old gustatory system now developing a sense of moral outrage. It's the same system. So a lot of what we might say, I just don't like him, is the same way as we say, I just don't like broccoli. We don't know why. It just, people who are socially conservative, if you pump a good smell into the room and then question them, they'll be more socially liberal. People who are socially conservative will have more cleaning products in their house, more prone to disgust more quickly. I don't know what it is about those immigrants, but I hate them. You know, Pauline Hanson probably has all kinds of cleaning materials and smelly candles in her house. So the more socially conservative you are, the more easily disgusted you are. So yeah, what is this human psychological whatever? We are biopsychosocial creatures, biologically, sociologically, and psychologically. It all just bleeds in, and pain is one of those good examples of something that you can't distinguish between the one and the other. So if we think psychology, we have deep emotions that are all physical. They're completely somatic. We then have feelings, which is how we reckon, okay, I think I have emotions, and this is what I think they are. Already getting a bit inaccurate. And then we have thinking, which is our psychological mechanism for trying to make sense of the world. And those three work in an ecosystem that we have to coach. So in a way, you can't not coach emotion. Long-winded answer, but where psychology begins and biology ends, you'd have to be really dumb to think there is something like that.
Oh, that's perfect. That kind of leads into the next question that I heard you talk about yesterday, actually. And it was that to understand psychology, we must understand irrationality.
Yes.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so we're kind of driven by rational irrationality, a concept that Dan Ariely came up with. And he was an economist who, you know, was trying to look out for all the things that we do which are really weird. And he was talking about the same thing here. In other words, we behave irrationally because we're emotional creatures. Now, think about a child who has its first feeling of fear. It doesn't know it's anxiety. It's sitting in its bedroom. It's safe. Mom and dad have gone to bed. It's sitting alone in a dark, vaguely dark room. And the child works out that it's somehow afraid and there's nothing to see. So the child becomes rationally irrational. It must be something I can't see. Oh, ghost, monster, vampire. Mommy comes running in the room. What's wrong? I'm scared of a monster. There's no such thing as monsters. The kid is now invalidated and sits there going, then why am I scared? Oh, you're not scared. It's just anxiety. Well, anxiety is fear of the unknown, of the future, of the unseen. So we don't try and discount human emotions like that, but we are rationally irrational because when we do make what we think is a rational decision, the 300 million year old limbic system has already decided what is going to be the threat or not, and has already largely dictated our system. The prefrontal part of the limbic cortex, if you believe that it is just janitorial. It's mopping up what the lower limbic systems have done. So in the mopping up for us all, we find ghosts and monsters. Health anxiety is another one. what does anxiety do? It pumps a lot of energy into your body, into your long muscles, so you can run away from a lion. To do that, your heart rate has to go up. Your liver has to dump glycogen. Your blood has to accommodate the glycogen. Your insulin has to regulate the glycogen. There's a whole enormous amount of things going on, and your heart is beating too fast. It doesn't need the air. So it skips a few beats. It sleeps a bit longer because it doesn't need to push so much oxygen through. And now, oh my God, you see, I feel bad, actually anxiety. And it must be my heart. Actually, it's anxiety. And I go to the ER. Actually, it's anxiety. The doctor's really rude after doing a whole bunch of blood tests. It's actually anxiety. You go home saying, it can't be anxiety. It must be a brain tumor. Off to the GP, MRI scan. It's just anxiety. So we're full of these irrationalities. And then the biggest one is we say, mental illness. Well, apart from learned helplessness and a bit of negativity, I don't know what mental illness is. This is all somatic.
Can I just go back to that example you used around the children thinking about monsters? And because my 4-year-old does that at the moment.
Yeah.
How does one, as a parent, approach that? Do we have to validate the feelings that, yes. They have seen a monster there?
Well, they haven't seen a monster, but if you look out of the corners of your eyes in dark areas where the rods and cones don't actually match up, you may very well see movement. People with temporal lobe epilepsy can see weird movement, but very much the corners of your eyes are designed to see movement. They're not designed to see accurately. That's in front of you. And we have whites in our eyes so that our targets can see where we're looking. You know, that's why my dog doesn't, because he doesn't want the cat to know that he's looking at it. So what we do with the kids, you don't invalidate. You go, oh my God, monsters, yes, now. Get the camera. If you can get a picture of a monster, Mommy and Daddy will buy a new house and we will be absolutely wonderful. And then the kid has to sit up the whole night and you keep on checking on him. Every 10 minutes, I'll make sure you haven't fallen asleep because I really need you to take a picture of the monster. This is so exciting. But of course, monsters hate coming when there's a camera or whatever. And you check on the kid. And of course, after 10 minutes, they're sleeping. I find it good to wake them up and then scream at them for falling asleep while we're trying to take monster pictures. And of course, they sleep because they fall asleep with the camera, you know. Other things, obviously, you can make big monster traps because you want to catch the monsters, because we can put them in the zoo and the circus. We want to study them because nobody's ever found a monster. So for the kid, that starts to be real. If there are monsters there, why has no one ever found one? And Dad and Mom are saying, yeah, of course you're scared. It's okay. The camera's going to take a picture. And once you get a picture, that monster's out of here, you know. And we'll put your smelly football boots under the bed so the monster won't come there. Their head smells. And by the way, when we dream up the worst monster and draw it, we're going to put a picture of you in the monster's heart. This will be your monster. And because it's the scariest monster, you can imagine it's going to eat all the other monsters. And then you go and do some drawings and you scatter half-eaten monster bodies around the room. While the kid's sleeping, he wakes up in the morning, there's dead monsters everywhere. If that doesn't work, buy him a dog and go to bed.
So create an irrational story around fear is one way of de-escalating your physiological response to it.
Well, anxiety needs a playground, and anxiety often just comes out of the blue because the 300-year-old network, the default mode network, really is inaccurate. So it will look for something. It will look for health anxiety. It will look for paranoia. Martin Luther, the great founder of the Protestant church, had obsessive compulsive disorder. He used to pray and wash himself 5 times a day. He used to confess to the priests and drive them mad 5 times a day. He wrote, the more I wash my hands, the dirtier they get. He had enormous rituals. He couldn't walk through doors and other things. And of course, he became very functional. If you get anxiety right, you're going to be famous and start a whole religion. If you get it wrong, you're just going to land up on Valium or something. So, it needs a playground. So we give it a playground and then it dies out.
So does that playground, can that be physical and from a psychological point of view, or does it tend to start from psychological first and then you take a physical approach?
Yeah. So, the point is that anxiety is natural. It's when it reaches certain levels or physiological feedback mechanisms are not limiting it, or we become observers of it and worried about it, or we have a full-blown panic attack. It finds a playground. When we wake up feeling bad in the morning and anxious, we have to think, was it the food? Was it this? We try and make sense of it. So the first thing to realize is that it's fairly harmless. It will kill you, but only when you're much older. We don't die of anthrax or dysentery or, leprosy anymore, or childbirth, hopefully, or poverty. Well, we still die of poverty. But nevertheless, we die of stress-related illnesses, diabetes, Alzheimer's, heart disease, all of these things. So in the short term, it's not harmful. In the short term, we can learn to manage it. And in the short term, it's not a brain problem. It's a very old body in a very modern world. So we need to learn to do certain things to take anxiety out of the playground. The first one is don't let it have a playground. No, you're not ill. You have anxiety. No, you don't have to worry about germs on your hands. It's anxiety. So we enhance the person's sense that what they do makes a difference. We give them tools to help them not reduce the anxiety, but we work on the context that is pushing the anxiety. People with anxiety have given up gym. They've started to eat crap. They're not moving as much as they used to. Their sleep hygiene is terrible. They're avoiding sleep, or they're lying in bed for hours worrying instead of getting out of bed. So we have a whole range of techniques to get people to lessen the context so that the anxiety is controlled. But you've got to live with it. My friends from Tignum, Scott, says in order to get anywhere in life, you need to exceed your own image and deal with the anxiety that causes. So Scott Pelton of Tignum recognized in athletes, and he shares a place we used to in Arizona with us. He recognized the idea of it's unavoidable, but don't give it a pathological playground of health or of ghosts or of monsters or of God or of anything. And if you think about what religion does, it's really a great way to deal with anxiety through joining a whole bunch of people, saying the same words, believing the same things, all having the same values, because that calms anxiety and makes you feel less alone. So people find different ways to deal with it, channeling it into anxiety or friendships or alcohol or whatever they do.
Can we experience anxiety if we don't have learned helplessness or negativity?
Yeah, look, my daughter obviously has ADD. When I tell her, don't call me, I'm on a call, and she calls. So the question is, anxiety happens first, and then we try to fix it. And given we can't fix it, we then develop the learned helplessness, which in turn makes the anxiety worse. If you keep on failing, you're going to keep on getting more and more anxious. So that's the problem here. First, you will get anxiety out of the blue. You will look for some kind of reason. And I don't know, whatever your particular bent is, whether it's health or supernatural invasion or Donald Trump, you will find something which is the reason for it. And then you'll try and avoid it, or you will try and cure it through avoidance or some other pathological mechanism, or you'll get stuck or fused to your thoughts. And then, of course, you develop helplessness and you excessive rumination. And this is what psychology targets.
So we both work in professional sport throughout the years, you in America and me in Australia. And performance anxiety is quite, I guess, a topic that of both me and you have probably come to experience a lot. What advice have you given to, say, athletes or high-performing individuals that come to you with trying to work on performance anxiety?
So here's the issue, and sort of repeating what Scott Pelton said. If you're going to be a peak performer, anxiety is not a pathology. And the idea of treating it as a pathology can create a whole lot of issues. So Peak performance psychology was the original name for sports psychology. And I think most of us would refer to ourselves then as peak performance specialists rather there. So the idea is there is normal amounts of anxiety, otherwise just known as stress or pressure. And we might be prone to worrying or something else. But anxiety itself is the physiological runaway phenomenon of having uncontrollable anxiety or panic. So we need to distinguish between those two. There is functional anxiety, which we have all the time, all the day, because that's how cortisol works. Oh, it's a stress hormone. Without cortisol, you're dead. Nothing happens. Your brain, your anterior pituitary, nothing works. So the idea of treating anxiety was, how do you deal with increasing your performance while staying in the zone? Now, what would the zone be? The zone is, as you will probably know, the absolute matching up of what you think you're capable of and what you think you have to produce. And that means your thinking stops. You're no longer thinking. You are using cerebellar skills, cerebellar vermis. You're using highly trained skills. You're just going into operational mode. And if you think about what pathological anxiety is, it's when there's a mismatch between what you think you're capable of and the other perception is what you think you're facing. So pathological anxiety can come into going ahead in the first minutes of a game. That anxiety derails you because you are stressed out by going ahead. And now you don't defend properly, or you're shocked, or you're too busy celebrating. These are all forms of distractibility. So the idea of helping someone be a peak performer is pretty much going, if you're going to perform, you need to develop an organism that is capable of performing. So if you are a businessman or woman running your own corporation, sitting on the boards, trying to bring up children, dealing with financial aspects, traveling, you need to be an elite athlete. So EXOS, 4 pillars, when I joined, was movement, nutrition, mindset, and recovery. By the time I put my stamp on it, I hope with the help of Craig Friedman and others in the performance innovation team, mindset was the number one piece. Mindset, movement, nutrition, and recovery, because it's all going to be about the mindset of a peak performer. And then we start to say, okay, what are we going to train to stop a person becoming pathologically anxious, or pathological as in their body is breaking down under the stress of training without recovery, or overtraining, or doing all kinds of things. So we developed the science of exercise, where you have to feel for it. And these are copyrighted. You have to feel for it. You have to move for it. You have to think for it. And you have to recover from it. And this really drove us to $1 billion a year business in 10 years. And the answer is simply, we develop resilience in the athletes to the life they have to lead. So sleep hygiene, diet, very personalized nutrition, very personalized, very unusual training, drawing on really good movement recovery strategies, working on mindset of supporting autonomy, which means matching the corporate values to the values of the athlete, athlete-centered training, surrounding the athlete with people who think and behave like the athletes and listen to their values and adapt. Because if you're in a team or in a coaching situation, or even the organization running the teams is out of sync with your values, with how you go about doing things, you're not going to perform. You're going to get anxious. So the answer to your question is context. We create a context in which anxiety does not become pathological. But if you bring in a new coach who doesn't understand the values of each person, if you bring in an organization with managing directors and CEOs and whatever else, or investors who don't understand the values, if there's a clash at any level between what is critical, cherished, and important to me and my teammates around me, then we have a problem. So anxiety is context. for the kid in the room, the athlete in a team, around the grand final, around the new coach, around putting two strikers on the same team at once, it's contextual. It's not an individual trait necessarily. There are genetics there, depending on childhood stresses, depending on all kinds of things, because genes don't define any of this, but certainly how the genes interact with context does. So in the modern idea of performance, or even general clinical theories, the third generation of science is contextual therapy.
It's fascinating hearing you talk about how Exos changed their 4 pillars, because I followed Exos when they were athletes' performance, and 2 of their probably most famous coaches from my field, Nick Winkelman and Brett Bartholomew, they've kind of, since they've left that field, they've put a ton of work on the psychology and the mindset part as opposed to the performance. So it's interesting. I would imagine your influence on them has been quite great for them to be in that state now.
Well, to this day, Nick and I are still in context, and he went off and did his PhD. We were both at Athletes Performance when it was about 100 people in total before it really got big. And Nick and Brett and Sue Falsoni and Daniela Lafata and everyone, these all moved on because they, you can only just have so many Uber coaches at Exos, and Exos, to their credit, really facilitate them going out there and doing their own thing. And, I met Brett when he left Exos. I went off to West Hollywood to see him, and he was just writing his book. Nick was doing his PhD while we were there, and then moved on to Irish rugby. So these guys very much picked up on the mindset piece well before. And it wasn't that I invented the mindset piece for them. It was just, I think I formulated for them the ideas of how neuroscience would work and created the neuroscience of peak performance, now a bit outdated, but nevertheless still relevant for the Exos Learns piece. I think over the years, as everyone did, athlete-centered coaching, a more mindset approach to how we manage context and values. And I worked for years with Tiffany Grimm and Craig Friedman in performance innovation, with John Stemmerman and others, creating the understanding of how mindset is a competitive mindset is equal to psychological flexibility, is equal to autonomy, mastery, purpose. And autonomy, mastery, purpose, relatedness, effect, and self-efficacy, all part of motivational science. So this all translates together in the work I'm doing at the moment in England, for instance, in how do we understand human neurobiology to the extent to which it influences psychological flexibility and therefore competitive athlete mindset, or CEO mindset, or the mindset of a sniper who has to run and dive and lie down and calm his heartbeat and take the shot.
Or the stay-at-home stressed mum trying to be present for her kids.
Everything where we are a peak performer because our bodies are not modern and our responses are incredibly primitive and can be influenced by a lot of things.
I wanted you to expand on your concept around working with or against our narratives when it comes to creating motivation.
Well, anything oppositional or perceived as oppositional, reactance theory kicks in. This is where even a suggestion you make, which goes against a person's values or goes against the way they would usually do things, change is resisted. So although the trans-theoretical model of change has been challenged, but it still remains fairly logical that you need to have a conversation. Good coaches ask, they don't tell. You are visiting the athlete's life. They are living it. If they are going to change, it's going to be on their terms, with their timing and pacing, and only what's meaningful to them. And a sense of mastery, as Michael Gervais, my friend, will emphasize again and again, depends on all of those things. No, you can't go in opposition. This is a collaborative effort, and the self-determination theorists will tell you, it's not about some inspiring coaching speech you make. It's about establishing a warm relationship with the athletes in which they encounter the reasons, the resolve. They make the argument for change. And if you can do that, they will achieve and do anything. Otherwise, it's just a fight. We need to be dancers, not boxers, right?
I think that I interviewed Paul Roos, the AFL winning coach, a couple of months ago, and he made mention that he kind of believes the reason why players liked him so much is that he was so authentic and kind of got the players into his life the way kind of he interacted with his family, with his kids, so they knew who he was as a person. So then they could kind of buy into him as a person, and then they would relate more to him as a coach. Which
sure. Well, liking matters. You know, there was a 40,000 person study for the National Institute of Mental Health in America. And out of all the things they found about therapists or coaches, liking them mattered. Trusting them. You know, we talk about faith and belief in ourselves. It's absolute rubbish. It can be broken by the first disappointment. If we trust the past, if we trust our track record, if we can trust the person who's coaching us because we have a track record of feeling understood, of heard, of not confronted, it does matter.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I'm just thinking about my experiences over the years when I've had certain head coaches or high performance managers who were very authoritarian, very dictatorish, and the players never really bought into what they were trying to do because they never felt they had control. They never felt they were trusted by the coaches to do a certain job, hence why they were always being told what to do. It's quite an interesting dynamic to see how professional athletes actually respond to being talked to. Like, language is huge.
Sure. And also you mentioned the word authenticity. A lot of people struggle because they're not being authentic, because they're not living life according to their own values. You know, and you will get the prima donnas who have a value system where they're constantly going off and their agents are phoning the coach and saying, no, he's not coming back and he's not doing this and not. Every coach and every coach-player interaction should be unique. Now, getting the players to de-individuate and form a cohesive team is one thing, but the coach's personal relationship with every single player needs to be boutique. It needs to be concierge, and it needs to be that the coach understands this is the value system under which this guy or girl operates. I can't violate it. And contextually, it's huge. I worked with Russian basketball players who had come from somewhere else and who had gone through a breakup of a relationship or had a bad relationship with an authoritarian coach. And their game was screwed. And after 5, 10, 15 contacts, they go on to win the Eurostar Cup with their team and spend the entire game on the court and, you know, speak to the press afterwards, telling the press what? It's mindset.
So why do you
context?
Why do you think there's still a massive divide between the old school way of coaching and this new kind of understanding of human psychology? Why do so many people still hold on to that, authoritative type of coaching? Because we know it doesn't work.
Well, first of all, where do these guys come from and girls come from in the first place?
True.
They're often exports people who borrowed it from before. We have a saying in academia that progress happens one funeral at a time. The old school have to die off. On average in medicine, and this is really sad, a new approach to doing something in medicine takes an average of over 17 years to filter down to common practice. Dan Pink says what science knows and what business does are two completely different things. There is no science of coaching generally. Most coaches come up through the ranks and they have their own idiosyncratic way that works or it doesn't. And that's why they do so well with one team where the values are matched. They go on to the next team and they're fired after a few weeks or months or screw up. Or they're really good with the players and rotten with strategy. Or they come from a failed system where they're absolutely screwed up and they move to a new system, but they take the same team with them, the same coaches, the same medics, the same, absolute disaster. The bums on seats mentality we see playing out since COVID. We have managers who insist on having all their staff sitting down in the workplace. They can't deal with working from home in a hybrid model. I am an old-fashioned, I'm old school, I tell you, bums on seats. So change is hard. Coaches don't have a science generally. They have their way of doing things. They might use very modern techniques like coaching videos where a certain player is marked and you can watch every ball he ever touched in his career, and they use all of these things, but they often fail for the same reasons as anyone else. They have no idea of what's going on in their own heads. And they become very difficult to deal with because when you do confront them, they become rigidly complimentary. What I say goes and that's it, often because they like the generals. But I love a general called Hal Moore who died recently, but Hal Moore was the guy who was the first American in on the choppers in Custer's 7th Cavalry. And he went into the valley of Ia Drang not knowing that his 400 soldiers would run into 2,500 Vietnamese. And he fought a 2-day battle where he beat the hell out of them and he won. But it was the first helicopter, thing, and he blew up trees and got these. And he had a simple take on strategy. What are you doing that you shouldn't be doing? And what are you not doing that you absolutely should be doing? And coaches don't ask themselves that. What am I doing that I shouldn't be? And what shouldn't I be doing? What am I not doing that I should be? And what am I doing that I shouldn't are two critically important questions for strategy. A lot of coaches don't have strategy. A lot of coaches will stick to, well, this worked here and that worked there. But they're not looking at the individuals and how the individuals best work. They don't often look, they have a captain in the team, but who's the natural leader? They don't bring in psychologists or often use psychologists. The Australian Olympic team, I think, went to London and didn't have a psychologist with them. They had vouchers to go and use any old psychologist, not understanding the difference between a clinical person who works with sick people and a peak performance psychologist who works taking amazing people to incredible. If you put a Michael Gervais in there, it would be a big difference to some bloke off the street in Harley Street, not understood by organizations. The effect of these sporting organizations on the performance of the player in the field probably accounts for 10 to 12% of the outcome. So the need for a coaching science, and Craig Friedman and myself at Exos have spoken about this with Mark Verstegen and others for years. The coaches need to have a science. They need to understand the brain and the body. And that's where Nick and Brett and Sue and everybody have gone into, just proving out the point that psychological flexibility, a values-based approach, spending time asking and getting to know and framing things around the athlete's way of doing things, that's how you elicit the best performance. And you cannot not coach emotion, because emotion is a 300 million year old screw up of coaching. And it is more powerful than the athlete himself or herself. So you have to manage it. And they have no idea.
That's brilliant. It makes me actually still think of examples about how as coaches, we don't really think too much around what we're doing, but athletes or people that we're working with, say health coaching or peak performance people, they really understand how you make them feel.
Yeah.
And an example I've just had a memory then, we had quite two older players when I was at the West Tigers a couple of years ago. One guy had been to jail and he was very perceptive and observant about his environment through, I guess, his past childhood. And he would tell me around the language that I would use coaching and the language that other people were using, other coaches, and then how that was interpreted and how it made the players felt. And I was taking a rehab session at the time, and this particular athlete was talking to me about that. And he goes, "Oh, look over there." And our marquee player was being told by our high performance manager, who was this old school mentality. He was trying to tell him what to do and was literally looking over his shoulder. And the player next to me goes, "I guarantee when that coach leaves, he's going to tell me or tell us that coach makes me feel like I'm a little kid."
Sure.
And I
And that's the committed, that's the rigid complementarity of the relationship. The only way they can respond is escalating symmetry, and it becomes a fight. But think about if the coach had said to him, look, do you need my help? Because I noticed that you're struggling with X, Y, and Z. This is what other guys like you have done. Which one of these do you think? Here's my top 4 of what I've seen with other guys. Which one of these would you like to try? Which one of these do you think would be the one that suits you? How would you feel if you tried this and it worked? Would you think that's a good idea? So really giving a menu of alternatives, of which obviously the coach has chosen the top ones, just the idea of I'm being asked, I'm not being told what to do, increases the likelihood of change. Sometimes just a suggestion given the wrong way will have the opposite effect, and you get oppositional defiant behavior. And how many players are ADD and prone to opposition? A lot of them. You're making a player humiliated, feel like they suck. And when you ask them to do something differently, a coach, do it differently, a player, do it differently. As Scott Pelton says, you're asking them to change an image of what they think the world is, they will become anxious. So yeah, we have to teach them to manage the anxiety of change, because change equals growth equals anxiety. So that's why I say you can't treat it as a pathology. The rules don't apply. Yes, you can teach players how to relax and feel better after a bad losing game, and you can teach them mental strategies. And if you're working with mixed martial arts fighters and cage fighters and boxers, you can teach them how to cope with pain, which is also one of these horrible things that's processed through the emotional centers before you even know you've felt it, and will dictate how much pain you feel. And if pain is so subjective, and if pain volumes can be turned down just by looking at people's recipes for pain, you can imagine everything else can too. So what science knows and what coaching and peak performers do are often widely different. And consequently, we don't get the best. And a player who's having the yips in golf, or who's not hitting the ball right in baseball, or not kicking the ball right in football, you can do a whole lot of mechanical things. And I wrote an introduction to Steve Hecht's book on just this topic. You can go and hit that ball for the rest of your day if you don't correct your mindset. And ask Tiger Woods what happened when his wife put a golf club through the back of his car. It took him a long time to come back. And of course, he's got pain, knee pain, back pain. That's going to be made really worse by what he went through. All of these things make it more difficult. Put him out on the putting green, the driving range. Get his mind right first. So we use a lot of metaphoric and other kinds of things. But it's quite amazing, when you look at skeleton races who've got such tiny increments. When you look at individual tennis players who've got such tiny increments, it's really difficult. Those tiny, subtle things are emotional and not conscious and powerful.
Can you expand on what actually the yips are?
So yeah, if you think about the skills you learn at first, they take a lot of the central process of your brain, and then you generalize those, and your cerebellovermis takes over. You start thinking, and you start using your thoughts, which are motor activity. Your thoughts are prefrontal cortex. This is a motor area. Your thoughts work like motor areas. Your thoughts become a motor error. And now you're hooking or slicing, or you're misputting in the yips. Now you are focusing and concentrating, and you're not using an inherent skill. So the Japanese archers, the Zen archers, have a lovely term. I think it's called, excuse the Japanese, whenever I speak Japanese people look at me and go, what the hell is that? Sakeha, which means no work. In other words, the zone. Zen archers, the arrow will find the target and off they go. But if they think there's a problem, they're dead. Yogi Berra, the great American baseball player, wrote, I can think and I can hit, but I can't do both at the same time. And so when you start to have an emotional issue on the greens, on the putting greens, you stop hitting the ball properly because you're using those areas and you're infusing motor error. And that motor error is emotion, which is a physical, somatic issue. Your heart's beating too fast, your blood pressure's too fast, your concentration, which needs to be razor sharp, and calculating the flow of the green and the curve of the ball, all of that's going out the window. And the worse it gets, the worse it gets. So getting the person into a mindful state of getting them away is not hitting the ball endlessly. It's sitting with a sword on the green and meditating on the sword, standing up and just letting your zone take over. So thinking ain't good.
You've made mention before on a couple of times now, value-based coaching.
Yeah.
Can you explain how that actually works? So you're talking about value-based coaching from the coach's perspective, as well as understanding the values from the recipients, say the athletes or the people that you're actually dealing with?
It's a matching job. In other words, when you go to work with people, whether it's in the workplace or in the military or especially coaching players, you need to sit down with each one and ask them a simple question as you would for someone who is suicidal. What is important to you now? It's like being an air traffic controller. You've got them ranked up. You've got your values lined up. Which one's the most important to you? And you find out, first of all, what the organization's values are in terms of how they want to go about doing things. Then the player's values, how the player wants to go about doing things. And then yourself as a coach, how you go about doing things. What is cherished? What is beloved? What is necessary? What is absolutely religiously, fanatically important to you, your players, the organization? And when you get those lined up and optimized and agreed, when you can accommodate the values of each and every person, if not in the same hierarchy, but in general, yes, we will do this. How does this player best learn? What are they thinking about you? How do you align and have the beer conversation? I don't know if you've ever sat with a drunken person and you're the bartender. I did that for a few years.
I did it for 6 months when I first moved to Australia.
Yeah, I mean, a drunken guy will tell you very quickly when you've shown him compassion and listened to his nonsense. You and me are the same. You and me, we think the same. We're the same. He feels that affinity that only drunken people can feel with a total stranger.
And you're just and all you're doing is just agreeing with him.
Because that's values. You know, you're matching him and you're not screaming at him. And then when you come to take his car keys, because he's absolutely drunk off his bracket, off his face, he'll say, okay, because you've built a relationship. And you build a relationship because you don't want an angry drunk on your hands and you don't want to get into the fist fights. And I had plenty of those on the pavement, duking it out with drunks who came in. And I always explain to my coaches when I'm training them all, my students, when I used to work in the restaurant, I would spot the guy coming in on his own or with his friends and they were drunk. And I would stop them at the front door and I would not seat them. And I would say, gentlemen, you guys have had a lot to drink. It can only go one of two ways. You're going to come in here, sit down, order, eat, pay, no problem. Anything else, we're going to be beating you up and throwing you on the pavement. So if you come in, understand my values, understand what you're here for. Throwing up, doing stuff, whatever, been there, done that. You guys are not doing it. You'll be escorted out of here. You will pay. You will not get food. You'll be in trouble. Are we clear before we start? So that's the context, the rules, the values, all there. It was rigidly complementary. My way or the highway, and they go, and they walked. Or they came in, sat down, and when I walked around watching them, they were like, don't mess with this guy. And had a really nasty face I could put on thanks to my mom. And, you know, I learned my mom's face and I would scare the crap out of them. So values can be imposing, yes, but if you want collaboration, cooperation from an athlete, in a corporate sense, people you're going to have more than one conversation with, you need to get to know them and what is critical, important, cherished, vital, authentic, valid for them. because we all need something, three things in life. We need somewhere to live, we need someone to love, and we need something authentic and valid to do with our lives every day. And the coach must make sure that what the athlete is experiencing is authentic and valid for them. This is not boot camp. This is not the military. The sergeant who trains you, the corporal, the drill sergeant who trains you, does not go into combat with you because you would kill him. He's not the officer or the NCO that you follow into battle. That guy is different. That guy looks after you. That guy cares for you, and you care for the guy next to you. Your drill sergeant doesn't give a shit. His job is to boost and break you. So the drill sergeant's stuff is not the coach who takes you into battle. You would shoot him in the back.
So does that mean then most head coaches, I say, or even thinking about the sergeant side of things, are they all incredibly narcissistic and think about more their own place and where they're heading as opposed to what the team is doing or what their platoon is doing?
Sure, they're hired on the basis of what they've done before. And so they are under pressure to produce the same results, but it's so individualistic. So each coach will come with their own style. Why do they not look at the science of how? And I have no problem with the skills they have. I have the problem with the interpersonal skills they don't have. They can still get their agendas across if they have a grand scheme of what this team should look like. I don't have a comment on that. I'm not a coach at that level. What I do have is an understanding of how they can get that done or not. How do you get the best out of people? Motivational interviewing, self-determination, reactance theory, acceptance commitment, values-based, autonomy respected. Coaches don't respect the autonomy of the player. They violate it all the time. And in many ways, the player has to de-individuate and give up some autonomy, but it needs to be on their terms. You will get the best out of a player if you've matched your values to theirs and there's an understanding. And if they do have to sacrifice a value, that will be a choice they will make with you. I know this is what you want and this is what is important to you. I haven't forgotten it. But for now, we need the team to do X, Y, and Z, and then I will be coming back to you. And we will talk about, again, what's important to you. Duly noted, but for now, I'm going to, like a good flight traffic controller, I might have to put it down the line a little bit, but we will always come back to it. So if players make sacrifices, they need to know why. They need to make the argument for that with the coach as to why they will give up certain things. Because imagine you're playing both in a national team and in your club. There's a war. There is a bunch of negotiations all the time. What are you sacrificing where? You're going away for a 4-week camp. What are your wife and children doing?
Well, that just makes me think of how wrong most professional sports teams are running things.
Yeah. And again, I did some work with, the late Bruce Marshall, who was consulting to some very big footy teams. And we wrote some really good stuff. He had come to me with all of these findings. And we wrote some really good stuff and got it rejected from the board and kicked out because there's resistance to this, because you're giving up power and control. It looks like it's meta-complementary, but there really is the need for a coaching science that goes more than strength and conditioning and goes more than goal setting. I mean, if you're going to set goals with a team, the only way you keep to goals is if they are following and driven by your values. And what are your values? If you don't know what people's values are, what the hell are you setting goals with them for? How old is the athlete? What does the athlete still want to accomplish? What kind of family structure do they have? Who are they at the base of it? How do they relate? Who's the natural leader for them in the team? a million other questions around the values. What is their life like in spirituality? You've got Christians playing on Sunday and Jews playing on Saturday and Muslims training through Friday lunch when they should be at the mosque.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it just makes my brain is just going nuts around just ways to like whether creating goals based off specific groups of players is a smart way of looking at things. Like it's definitely got me thinking.
Yeah, one of my coaches who was working in rugby league, who read my textbook, my third edition, he sat down with one player who was a real problem, and they sat down and had a good few beers and chatted for a long time. And I said, how did that go? And he said, look at the goals. And he had pages, and this guy has 91 goals.
Wow.
When you start talking values, he's a youngster, and what he wants to do is enormous. And the coach said 5 of those goals were to do with the team. Way into 80 more had to do with his own life and what he wanted to achieve through the sport, through the game, through the team. And the coach said, this is going to keep me with this youngster for 10, 12 years to help him with all of it. And the coach said to him, apart from the 5 with the team, I will help you with every single thing. And this kid was the player of the year that year. He won the medal.
Wow, that's amazing.
I've got kids who came from University of San Francisco, where I worked with Go-Go Sports, who are the mindset trainers there with Yvonne Gomez. Just unbelievable if you matched up with their values, if you understood how their brains worked, if you pegged whether they were good emotionally or not. And then I did screening of the US national soccer team, the men's team. And it was very interesting because the personality types were irrelevant. The brains of the goalkeepers were different to the backs, were different to the midfield, were different to the strikers, who were completely different to the forwards. You would think strikers and forwards would have the same kind of brain, very different. So the better athletes are the ones who come from the better colleges, more intelligent, better sports people if they have the basic talent. Why? They're better able to work with their own values, and they're much more, they're less oppositional, defiant, much more conversational, much more able to reason and use logic, much more verbal, much better backgrounds as kids, less stresses. When you're dealing with an athlete who's lying on a massage table and you see their tears trickling down their cheeks and you go and whisper, "What's up?" Thinking of all the girls that I messed around, got pregnant, forced sex on. Now I'm successful. They're going to come for me. Now I'm successful. My family is going to be knocking at my door and wanting money. Now you've got an athlete, let's say American football, who at average at 40 is going to be divorced, broken, brain damaged. You've got to be so clear on his values and what he wants early on, because his life can go dreadfully.
How do you work with treating people with traumatic brain injuries post-football? Do you do a lot of work in that space from people transitioning out of that into the real world? And I guess what are the major challenges that you face and how do you deal with it?
Look, we've known about that since the 80s. Kina Geffen and her son and her husband did a whole lot of studies on AFL players here. You know, brain injury is absolutely part of contact sports. Soccer players from Scandinavia in the 70s and 80s, I was writing about football players from Scandinavia with brain damage from hitting the ball. The question is, what about boxers? What about mixed martial arts fighters? It's part of sport. And what do? They need to understand they've got to quit early. We've got to manage concussions even better than we do. That instability, once you've had a single concussion, then you get a second and a third, past 3 concussions, what are you doing? But that's what these guys know. You know, very few players who go to Barcelona's coaching schools or who go into the American Combine and draft will ever make it, will ever kick a ball. They go into boxing and get beaten to a pulp. That's the field. They take that on. Better helmets that can absorb the twisting bang. It's not the crushing blow. It's the sudden movement of the head with the brain bashing around. It's disheartening, but yeah, the macho sports come with a lot of trouble. The guys sign on, they need to know. Some brains are more resilient, some brains are not, depending on amyloid proteins and whatever else is going on, and incomplete BA4 cleavage, whatever's going on. The answer to that is, if you're going to go into those sports, you might have to know what you're sacrificing for. You need to be clear on your values defining those goals, because you're going to pay a very heavy price.
I've talked about this at length with players that I've worked with in and around their body being broken by early 30s or even late 20s. And the majority of them are all willing to sacrifice that for the potential of winning a premiership.
Absolutely. Look, Olympic runners will take drugs. Flo Joyner, whoever was one of those, they're willing to take a drug that gives them a gold medal and know that it will kill them 6 months later. They will take it. That's the point of why we as a society reward aggression. We pay to see it. And that is a problem, because testosterone is going to help you, be aware of your social status. And a lot of poor people see getting into boxing and dangerous sports as a way of making it in the world. And they'll tell you it's absolutely worth the sacrifice. But if you ask the wives and children and husbands and employers and parents, you get a slightly different version. I'd rather he kept his brain and didn't make money.
You said something really interesting there. As a society, we reward aggression.
Oh, yeah.
How does that actually work?
Well, look at Australia. Australia has a tall poppy syndrome, which on the one hand is nice because we all see each other as equal. When you're in the pub and the guy next to you cleans toilets, you don't look down on him. The postie's a big mate. The builders are all your mates. So we're very much less structured. The exceptions are if you are royalty or celebrity sports or others. Then you get worshipped and the rules don't apply. Then you can drum it up. We want you to be humble, but we also understand when you're arrogant. We love watching programs that are reality TV, like Married at First Sight and all of these programs that have a lot of personal, verbal violence. We reward athletes. We reward executives for aggression, competitive, toxic aggression. Under the right circumstances, we reward it. Under other circumstances, like domestic violence, we punish it. But the brain doesn't know too much of the difference. We reward violence. You watch, I don't know if you ever watched South African rugby coaches telling them, go out there and fuck them up. That's the physical game the Springboks have been so guilty of sticking to, and hopefully getting more intelligent about the game. But we reward that. We reward the hits. What is American football without the hits? Somebody goes down, and I've got videos of what their heads are doing. It's frightening, but we really reward it because we want to see it. Look at boxing, look at wrestling, look at mixed martial arts, look at judo, karate. We reward aggression. Oh, it's a sport, an aggressive sport.
It's a very it's a hard paradigm to try and get your head around, because say in a professional team, for 90% of the week, you are trying to teach these people to be as aggressive as possible and to essentially kill their opposition. And then for the other 10%, they're supposed to go and go out, maybe get on the piss, get drunk with their friends, and be semi-normal in terms of their aggression or their testosterone levels. Like, it's such a hard shift for them to go from that space for all of their life and then have an hour or two break from that and then have to kind of be a totally different kind of persona or like an energy level. Like, it's really hard to find that balance for them, isn't it?
Well, it depends, and it's cultural. If you go and watch New Zealanders in terms of their supporters, You see a lot better sportsmanship than Australians. That's part of the culture there.
We're just better people.
Absolutely. And then you go and have another look at various other things, why do we have to be so aggressive? Why do we have to do that? And now, if you don't know it's cultural, think about alcohol. What are we likely to do when we get drunk in a pub and get really drunk as the boys? What are we likely to do?
Well, obviously, probably get into trouble, fights, potential arguments.
Right, unless you're French, of course. If you're British or descended from British colonial stock, and you go into the islands where the British invaded and introduced alcohol, people get drunk and get violent. If you go to the French-owned islands, people get promiscuous. This is learned behavior because alcohol is non-specific. It's just a disinhibitor. So if you're training boys to be more aggressive, they will express that on the sports field where it's encouraged. Or if you're training them to be more French, you better lock up your daughters. So it's a cultural expression of violence. I mean, what has the skill got to do? You know, the gentlemen in sport who really behave beautifully and brilliantly and stop the game because the guy is injured, or, don't trip a guy because, well, it's a professional foul and you needed to save the game. And the guys who are doing the marathon running who stop and help another guy across the line, they're just not aggressive. But if it's a screw you, I'm going to win at all costs, like Maradona's hand of God and all other kinds of examples, well, there's a problem. Sometimes you see a guy in motor racing getting really aggressive because someone cut him off and knocked him off his bike. Was it a mistake, or is he angry because they were aggressive in deliberately knocking him off his bike? We reward aggression. And it's all subject to interpretation. If I come up to you and punch you in the nose, that's aggression. But if we're on a ring with gloves on and there's a referee, that's a sport. There is no difference. The chances are if I come up to you and punch you, it's just once. In the ring, I'm going to punch you 200 times around. And my job is to actually give you brain damage enough so that you can't finish. That's what people have against the sport. And if you watch beautiful boxers, that's amazing. If you watch beautiful MMA, it's amazing. If you watch them just kicking each other to pieces, honestly, watching amazing stuff. Brilliant. But we're rewarding aggression. We pay good money to see it, and putting young men's lives on the line, hopefully they make good money because they're going to struggle. And not only that, by 30 odd, they can't play anymore. What are they going to do? So I'm really grateful to see how many charities like Crossing the Line, or how many teams are training their players what to do when you are finished, what to do when you lose your athlete identity, how you're going to be aggressive in a nice, popular way. And then we look at how many of them are depressed. We've got so many good examples of Ian Thorpe and Grant and everybody else who's come out and told us how depressed and miserable they got. Their values weren't being met. They weren't living life according to values that weren't money, fame, success, I don't know what.
So they had shaped their identity around the sportsman more than the person. Is that what you're trying to say?
Correct. And also taking on aggressive or other values that they may not have really been inherently part of their plan, and nobody was really sitting with them. I would hope somebody did, but gradually they would come out. When we went to see some of these guys, they'd hand us the Olympic medal, put it on kids. The medals were battered, the ribbons were dirty. They didn't care about those medals anymore. If people would take drugs that killed them, as long as they won a medal, these guys had learned, their values had shifted. It's a piece of material with a bit of metal hanging on it. So the lack of values in sport, where you get guys taking bribes or betting or beating up their girlfriends. Every year in America, these young men are urinating in public, beating up people in the bars, driving without a license, driving with unlicensed firearms, speeding, dying of overdoses, occasionally shooting themselves and coaches and God knows what. there is something really nasty, and the coaches are the ones to deal with this more effectively. Driving their forces, their troops along, using combat kind of metaphors and whatever. Look, there is a ridiculous other side. Marty Seligman tried to push positivity onto the American military and got 120 million in funding from it. And it's not a good idea to teach soldiers to be positive. They get killed. So I think there's all other kinds of things there as well. So look, it's a complex field, and that's why I would want behavioral scientists involved with teams, with coaches, where coaches should be going to a university or college, learning how people really are peak performers, how they best operate, what autonomy and mastery and purpose and relatedness have to do with everything, how you get the best out of human beings through being a peak performance coach who understands, I am just visiting this person. I don't know what their values are. I don't know what's authentic or valid for them. I'm going to ask them. I'm going to accommodate them. I'm going to explain the sacrifice and get them to make the arguments for why they want to do what they're going to do for our team. And it's not difficult. It can be taught. It is a series of manual interpretations. You can use a manual for it.
I'm very, very on board for all of this from a coaching point of view. I would imagine the biggest kickback from coaches would be that they would feel doing this, that they wouldn't be in control, which is probably the biggest issue of all.
But that's the point, you're giving up control. However, it's not complementarity, which is rigid. It is not allowing for escalating symmetry. If I put the athlete in control, I am defining the relationship as one in which I give control. I'm in control. Meta complementarity means in communications theory that I am saying to the athlete, I will help you on my terms. You will be in charge because I have handed that over to you and I can take it back at any time. If the athlete wants me to be the expert and tell me and tell them what to do, they can tell me they want me to be the expert. They can anoint me and appoint me the expert, but I only do that with their permission. I'm only the expert if they give me the right to be. I'm still in control.
It's brilliant. The war of control with both sides of your brain and how we can kind of understand and use that to try and get us to what we want to do.
Well, the answer is that 300 million year old default mode mechanism is constantly scanning the world for danger. So we have to watch out. The biggest enemy we have is that our thoughts are wonderful if we use them as language like you and I have been talking. Thoughts inside our head go toxic very quickly. So in that war, we have to discount a whole bunch of stuff that this default mode network, this 300 million year old system is throwing at me.
Why is that? Is that to keep us safe from an evolutionary point of view?
Yeah, so the default mode network, if I put you in an MRI scanner and tell you don't think of anything, completely shut down, just stay focused on your toenails and think nothing, all the elements of your brain are talking to each other. They're all collaborating like an orchestra without the conductor. They're all just talking amongst each other, and they're evaluating the inner and outer world for threat. There's no direction. If that mold network is set too high, you're going to have a propensity for threat, for danger, and your thoughts are going to pick up on that. And now your thoughts are going, wow, and this isn't going to be good, and I don't know what's going on here, and I don't think he likes me. And those thoughts and the fusion, the stickiness of those thoughts is something that we need to deal with. And that's where being in the moment, mindfulness, staying in the zone, all of those techniques come in. The most important thing we can think of is, Rudy Giuliani and Newt Gingrich and all of these Republicans, when everybody was playing fast and loose with the truth and Trump was just lying through his teeth. They said some very interesting things. Giuliani said, the truth is not the truth. And he's quite right. And then Newt Gingrich said, the truth is what you believe. In other words, the truth is not objective, and our thoughts are not objective. So being wary of the voices within. And the longest conversations, as Clement says, one of my collaborators in England, says the longest conversations you'll ever have are those with yourself. Those are conversations you have to worry about. So I'm working with Box Media and Box Play in the USA. We're an education technology company to bridge the intelligent IQ side of the brain and the emotionally complex side of the brain using language, because that's how we do it. So we're using language and teaching language skills to deal with stress. And Accenture and APAC and Kaiser Permanente and other companies are jumping on board because we're training staff in very high Emmy award-winning quality movies, very short, sharp education, how to use language effectively to balance the default mode network and keep this all under control. And speaking to people like Nick and others at Irish Rugby Football Union, and what can we do with players to start giving them better skills using internal language and how they relate and speak to others, and developing strategies for being excellent communicators internally and externally based on relational frame science and acceptance, commitment, and values-based stuff, because relational frames is how we learn without learning, just because our brains put these things together. And then, of course, artificial intelligence is giving us ways to do that in a more individualistic, non-hands-on approach. So lots of things going on.
Yeah, it's really exciting, actually, hearing all this. How can we use psychology and neuroscience to help us achieve our goals, or a goal in particular, just any goal?
Well, look, there are, it depends. Obviously, there's a whole lot of stuff out there for pathology, but in terms of peak performance, you want to get your brain to really be psychologically flexible. In other words, to not be driven off the rails by the stresses of being an elite athlete, which are considerable. And that means your diet has to be incredibly clean. Your exercise has to be incredibly well managed, and also obviously well managed in terms of don't get wiped out by a lack of recovery time. So for instance, Commonwealth bodybuilders working in the gym 5 days a week, how much recovery are they allowing? If you overtrain, you are 6 months off your best performance and so on. So that's where the science already is. And of course, mindset in terms of diffusion, experiential avoidance, values-based exercises, all of that kind of stuff, really critical. Understanding yourself in context, staying out of the miserable past, staying out of the anxious future. All of this is neuroscience-based. Understanding how this fight, flight, freeze works, using heart rate variability, breathing to get the vagus nerve in the heart, to keep you in parasympathetic recovery. Understanding that stress will switch off your digestion, switch off your testosterone and sex drive. If you're going to be dead by lunch, you're certainly not going to be digesting your food from breakfast. Read books like this one.
One of my favorites, Robert Sapolsky.
Exactly. Understanding that how you play football may be influenced by what your ancestors did for a living 400 years ago. Understanding human behavior is different from minute to minute, hour to hour, not labeling people. And the most important thing is focusing on context, on yourself. In what context are you best? In other words, if you have good days and bad days, what was the good day recipe? What did you do that gave you the best outcomes? On a bad day, what was the bad day recipe? What did you do from the second you're awake from the night before? I have a kid who lost his shit completely at 3 o'clock one afternoon. And when I track back, seconds to disaster, it was stuff from the previous afternoon started to set him up. There were 18 separate catastrophes, small and big, that led to his behavior. for which he was then suspended. It wasn't that behavior. He had stacked and then blown. So understanding our behavior in a longitudinal contextual sense. Without those contexts going wrong, this kid would never have blown up.
Now, I know you're a big fan of mindfulness practices. Can you explain what is actually happening to our brains when we are doing, say, meditative type practices?
Yeah.
How that is beneficial for a brain, and then I guess your tips and tricks around what we can be doing in terms of a practical application of meditation.
Now, look, everybody immediately defaults to meditation when they use the word mindfulness. Meditation is just one practice in mindfulness. The idea of mindfulness relates to the default mode network. So what Kabat-Zinn and others were talking about when they first got onto their hobby horses was they were looking for ways to get the brain into a quiet contemplative state, which is really kind of critical, right? Now, the default mode network is a resting state, which is either going to be overtuned to danger in the environment or is going to be quite happy and restful. So anything you do that is mindful, and this can include eating. Now, eating a square of chocolate slowly by allowing it to dissolve in your mouth is a mindfulness exercise. And it's not really a meditation unless you regard it as a meditation upon taste or something. Closing your eyes and looking at the patterns on the back of your eyelids and trying to get your spaceship enterprise to go into the dark recesses. Neurofeedback and biofeedback using heart rate variability or using a neurofeedback machine is going to allow you to self-regulate and bring yourself from sympathetic to parasympathetic breathing, or to the domination of your autonomic nervous system by sympathetic or parasympathetic tone. And what I mean by that, when you breathe in normally, your heart rate is metronomic. The R1, that spike at the top, the R1 to R1 distance is regular and exact. Now, that's nice and healthy as far as doctors are concerned, because when you go running down the road, it's going to be pounding nicely and regularly, but it's not healthy because you're in sympathetic tone when you're doing that. In other words, you're in fight, flight, or freeze. When you breathe out, your heart rate becomes a little bit, there's a braking effect called the respiratory sinus arrhythmia. There's a braking effect on the heart, and the beat to beat ratios are individual. In other words, your heart rate is varying, which is a sign, and the more it varies, the more relaxed and calm and in recovery you are, because you're pushing yourself into rest and digest. You're undoing the energy flow and your heart is erratic, which is healthy because it helps you withstand arrhythmias and so on. So the trick with heart rate variability is it's a form of training to stay in parasympathetic tone as long as you can. Simply breathe in normally. Breathe out very, 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 very slowly. You're spending more time in the relaxed state. So thanks to the bottom 1/3 of the vagus nerve being a recent addition in our evolution, we can control the nervous system that way. It drops the acidity of the blood. It opens up the arteries. It slows down the heart. It changes you from a high beta into a nice slow alpha rhythm, which helps you get to sleep or meditate. So all kinds of things help there. A gratitude ritual where you're looking at everyday items around you and just focusing on why you love those, that printer, that scanner, that shredder, that 5G internet, that multi-plug adapter, that Remarkable 2, that iPhone, this little thing that allows you to see what size the pupils are when you shine the light into them, every little thing, Sapolsky's Behave book, my book, I love, I'm so happy with the cover of it from 2014, Saving Your Life One Day at a Time, free plug for an old book.
Nothing wrong with that.
I like the cover of my third textbook. Those are mindful rituals. Going for a walk down to the beach without music on your ears is mindful, because you have to look at each bird, each wing, each branch, each leaf. the feeling of the grass underfoot, each smell, the sound of the Doppler effect of cars going past, looking around at the color of the sky and the different textures, the way the sun is bleeding down into the ground. That is mindfulness. So it is staying, and Mark Verstegen, the founder of Athletes Performance and Team Exos, there are three things you need in life for that. Focus, focus, focus. And more than anything else, staying focused is essential to not crashing your airplane, your car, your relationship, your life, your patient. Being athlete-centered is a form of focus. It's all neuroscience. It's not clinical psych. It's neuroscience of peak performance. And if I want you to set realistic, worthwhile, personal goals that are going to make you a successful human being, I need to know what your values are, or I'm not going to trust your goals. Goals without values, you're just talking.
Yep. Yeah, so true, isn't it?
Yeah. And what are values? How we go about doing things. What is critical about how we go about achieving success, doing whatever it is we want to do.
I heard you talk on one, I think the video yesterday I was watching, you were talking and you've made mention around ADHD with athletes. I was actually diagnosed with ADHD at 13, and I'm just wondering around you're saying in this talk that people with ADHD have a 30% delay in their brain in terms of
that's correct.
Are you able to expand on that?
Sure. So the term attention deficit comes from 1798, where a doctor in a medical journal described it very beautifully, but he just described the distractibility, and so he called it ADD. It's a disorder of disinhibition, of dysmaturity of the brain, so that being a neurodevelopmental, neuroatypical dysfunction, ADD, ADHD kids can do everything everybody else does. They just do it 30% later. Their connectivity and the way the whole orchestra comes together is really behind until about age 25, when it all catches up. And by then, of course, most of their education is past. They've developed some low self-esteem. They've struggled with relationships. They have time blindness. They're not able to do the difficult thing now, which will give them the best outcome in the future. They get caught up in the here and now. They're very mindful. They get caught up and only do what the environment tells them to do, not what is necessarily the best thing to do. That's the hardest thing to do, which is going to give you a good future outcome. So they can't simulate good outcomes in the future. It's a disorder of executive function, of disinhibition. And consequently, relationships, choosing good behaviors now over time, foreseeing consequence, making decisions that are future informed, that value the temporal distant over the here and now. Prepotent things are not good necessarily, driven by emotions and the default network. It can be very difficult until you're well into your 20s, and then we have to do a lot of damage control. I have some beautiful patients all over the world who are really creative, amazing, or sporty or talented, who are just in pieces by the age of 25. But that's when they're coming of age. That's when they can really start doing well. And many of them still need medication to do that. But once they understand what it is, we can fix the self-esteem. All of a sudden, they're doing business or getting better at sport and so on. So, that 30% lag just means I can do anything you can do. I can only do it later.
Yeah, from people I've talked to, and even just through my own kind of framework of things, I think the more I worked on the shame piece around having it or being diagnosed with it, and then changing my framework around thinking that I was broken, I needed fixing, and there was something wrong with me. Because I had all of the practices in place that gave me my dopamine and serotonin hits with training, ice exposure, meditation. So being able to combine both of those things has been a game changer for me.
Sure. And it's necessary because, if school is the only definer of what we do 8 to 10 hours a day, year in, year out, and we can't do what other people do, or we're constantly getting demerits, or we're constantly burning the food, or we're constantly doing these things, and we don't understand that it's not so much pathology, but just a neurodevelopment. I mean, self-control is not learned. You're born with it. You're born with those functions that need to be able to do the difficult thing that's the right thing to do when you have a choice, and to value and simulate all the outcomes of A, B, and C, and see which of the best X, Y, and Z it gives you. You can be thoroughly disadvantaged growing up and get kicked out of school and all kinds of things. And teachers are very poorly trained in anything that's not neurotypical. So being neurodiverse, which is really useful in creative and in football and in every sport and in COs and in emergency room nurses and specialists, in stand-up comedians, in door-to-door salesmen, in the military and the police, it's frowned upon in school, and you get suffer.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I have memories of going with my parents to parent-teacher interviews, and the teacher would always say totally scripted things, and then my parents would say, well, this is because he's got this, and they had no idea about it. And this was in the early, I'm 38, so probably early 90s is when, I'm probably early to mid 90s is when I first got diagnosed with it, and the teachers knew nothing about it.
Yeah, and that's still pretty much the case. So Alex Latouche and others are working with the departments now to get teachers to be more trained, more experienced in it before they even walk in. There's so much compliance. Teachers aren't even teaching. They're filling in bloody paperwork all the time. They're really struggling and underpaid, and it's just disastrous. We'll probably lose half our teachers in the next few years. They're just making it life difficult for them. So you do pity them, because, if you've got 30 kids in a class and on average 2 to 3 of them will be ADD or ADHD, what are they going to do? They need support. They need extra stuff. They don't get it. So all they can do is send the kids out, give them demerits, give them bounce cards to leave. The public schools are better at it. The private schools, from what I've seen, are shockers.
Why is that? You'd think it's the other way around.
The public schools have resources and they care, and they've got more and more of these kids who can't make it, so the folks aren't dropping 35K a year to educate them. But amongst them, you can find some amazing kids to work with, just lovely.
Why do you think we're seeing such an increase in these developmental behavioral, diagnoses? Well,
first of all, we're recognizing them. It's the same as people say, oh, where do all these transgenders or other people come from? Well, they used to get beaten to death, or they used to hide in back rooms and never show their faces, or they shut up about it.
Yeah.
The other thing is, when I grew up at school, it was unheard of, and yet I know a lot of kids were ADD or ADHD. But we would do 2 periods starting very early in the morning. There was not as much pressure to learn. There was no technology. We, at the end of 2 periods, we had a break where we would run around the school grounds playing football and running and doing, very active. The girls would be skipping. We would come back and do 1 or 2 periods, and then we had a physical training class where we did gymnastics and tennis and played football. Then we had a lunch break where we got refueled, and then we would have afternoon sports sessions, and then 1 or 2 set by 2 o'clock. We were sent home to the football fields and to the running around and skateboards, and we were very, very active, more than a marathon a week, more than kids are now. And then there were no social media at home. So we would be learning to read or reading books or listening to the radio while playing hobbies. We had a lot of hobbies, but mostly we would socialize with kids, kick the ball around the street, annoy other people, run up and down and have races, go exploring. We would walk 20, 30 kilometers from our house along the River Creek. So if you look at a kid now, before middle school, they will have sat for more than 10,000 hours than I did. And they now have, the New South Wales guidelines from the department would be kids shouldn't sit for more than 2.5 hours a day. The other thing is the long school hours, homework. We were at school from 7:30 until 1:30. Then we went home. We had half an hour homework, if that. And it was fairly simple. My parents were uneducated and they could do it. So very different life to which our brains were quite happy. And I would literally, if I had a pedometer, I probably did 30, 40,000 steps a day. So yeah, I didn't rely on it. Certainly to do. And the kids who were ADD were exhausted like me. And then, of course, there was no such thing really as extra lessons or remedial stuff. If you were crap, you were crap. And everybody accepted you were crap. But nobody mocked you for it. We just understood some people were crap at it. If you were crap at maths, you were crap at maths. So what? Nobody said you'll never get anywhere and you've got to do all this extra stuff, which stressed kids out no end. If a kid struggled with maths, it was up to his parents or people like me who math was no problem. I would sit and teach my friends. It didn't worry me. And I didn't humiliate them. And they were just crap at maths. That's all. And so they were good sportsmen or great painters or good with pottery or whatever.
So how can we incorporate this knowledge into our education system, and why hasn't it been done already?
Well, there are schools overseas where there are treadmills in the class for the ADD kids. And when they're losing their shit, they go on the treadmill.
That's brilliant.
A friend of mine in South Africa, a kid went off to some farm school or military school, where anytime the kid was feeling a bit distracted, instead of sitting in class and being told and given demerits, they have a bounce card, which means the kid, without explanation, shows the teacher the card, and he goes out into the fields and he runs for 20 minutes. And he climbs trees, he climbs the jungle gyms, he goes through the obstacle course, and then he comes back. There's a bubbler, he drinks some water and he sits down and he's good for another half an hour, 2 hours, and then he's off again. But I mean, he was expelled from every school known to mankind until he went into this school. Kid, come and go as you please, and if you're restless, go run. And that's all he did. And he got beautifully through school. What is he now? He's a mixologist. He goes around the world performing in bars.
Creative.
He creates cocktails. He writes books on cocktails. I'll give you a great example. There was a kid, when my daughter graduated from her performing arts school, which is in North Strathfield, McDonald's Performing Arts, in her final year of HSC, she decided she wanted to take off with her dance crew to go to New York. So in the middle of the HSC pre-trials and studying, they said, absolutely. Off she went with her group, side project. You can look them up on YouTube. And they won the crowd favorite, and they also won the competition out of 45 squads from all over the world. The Australian kids won. Now, that was great. At her graduation ceremony, they had a guest speaker who was an ex-pupil of the school, who'd been expelled from 11 different schools. And he, if my memory recalls properly, in his year, he came to them for the last year, and he was struggling along with it. So they kind of booted him out, and he went to do a project of his own kind, which is he spent 6 months traveling with a kind of a Dame Edna lookalike in South Africa. He used to call all these people Poppy, which means darling or doll. Peter Dirk Ace, who had an alter ego like Dame Edna. And he made a video which, if my memory serves me correctly, he won upper band 6 for his HSC. He did absolutely brilliantly, but it didn't worry him much because I think he won the Prix d'Or in Berlin for the best documentary. And he went on subsequently to make a documentary about New Zealand rugby, and he's a documentary filmmaker. Now, for a kid as a dropout, he said, for me, school was a waste of time. But he does these award-winning documentaries since he was 17. My colleague Claire Munn, who is dyslexic and ADD in London, at 19 wrote a script for a play about a rhino that gives birth to twins. And of course, rhinos don't give birth to twins, but this was what. And Paramount, I think, hired her and paid her to make the movie at 19. She's dyslexic, she's this, she's that. So the point of diversity, and that's why our Paralympics are so incredibly important. That's tremendously important that we keep our diverse populations happy and we understand their values, and we do a lot of negotiation with these kids at school, and we get them to be the best they can, whether they can sit still or do math or not. It's absolutely irrelevant to their contribution to the world.
That's brilliant. It's awesome. Okay, final question. Advice on how to live a life full of fulfillment, value, and happiness. How does one do that?
Know thyself and keep out of thy own brain.
Hardest thing in the world to do, isn't it?
Well, that's the point. And I think the critical aspect of everything is around how you communicate and how you balance your emotions and intellect through communication, which is what we're doing with CQ at Box Media and Accenture, and others have recognized that incredibly important aspect to it. It is really how you deal with other people. Like the Talmud says, like everything else, Hillel was asked to stand on one leg and describe the value of the Talmud. And he said, just treat everybody the way you want to be treated. And that depends on how you communicate, how you accept diversity, what you do with your own thoughts in terms of not running yourself into the gutter, and realize we're all different, but keep your thoughts external. Stay in the here and now of the real world and understand that the most incredibly difficult things happen in life. You trade out of it using your values. Whenever you're in trouble, you turn to your own values and you trade out of trouble on what is important to you.
That's brilliant. Where can people find you and talk about your books as well, most importantly?
Yeah, so they go to my horrendous website done by a friend of mine, I think in revenge, in black and orange colors, pretty much like this Exos top, old school athlete's performance. But yeah, they can go to roysugarman.com and make contact with me through there. Obviously, I'm out everywhere in the multiple companies I worked with Transhuman Incorporated, Social Health Innovations, Exos, Gratify locally, with Mind Experts International, just all over the place. So depending on what you want from me, you can find me just about everywhere. But I'd start with roysugarman.com and just have a look at that and take it from there.
Well, thank you very much. This was amazing. Like, I loved every bit of it. So thank you for your time, most importantly. I know you're a busy man.
Lovely. Thanks, Sarah. It was lovely to meet up with you and to chat.